Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on poverty and the European experience. We have three guests here, all of them longtime friends of Notre Dame, longtime friends of many of us here in this room. All of them from Italy, but bringing to us a very broad horizon and perspective on Europe in general. All of them students and scholars of European law and society and politics, and all of them with a great sensitivity to the material reality of what has been Europe historically and what it is today and the challenges that it faces. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to welcome these three great friends here again back to Notre Dame. I'll introduce all of them for you right now and then let them go through their presentations, and we'll have time for discussion afterwards. The first to begin will be Mauro Magatti, a professor of sociology from the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan. Mauro received his PhD from the University of Kent in Canterbury and focuses his research on civil society in contemporary democracies, cultural and social changes, and the implications of globalization. He's the director of the Center for the Anthropology of Religion and Cultural Change, which is a collaborative project encompassing a variety of different European universities. He's consulted for the European Union and the European Science Foundation and various other organizations of the Italian government and the Catholic Church and others. Last year, he was here at Notre Dame as a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute and has visited a variety of other universities in various parts of the world. Together with Mauro, in fact, as part of a joint project, we'll have Andrea Simoncini, professor of constitutional law at the University of Florence. His areas of research cover both Italian and European constitutional law, the dynamics of the sources of law, social rights, and the interrelations between natural law and positive legal systems, as well as environmental law, a little-known expertise area of Andrea that many of us only discover later. He's recently the author, together with Marta Cartabia, of the book Pope Benedict's Legal Thought, a dialogue on open reason and the foundation of law and politics, to be published by Cambridge University Press. Andrea also has been a visiting scholar, a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute, but also a visiting professor here at Notre Dame Law School, the first time as the holder of Notre Dame's Italian Fulbright chair. And thirdly, but certainly not least, Lorenza Violini, a distinguished scholar and professor of law at the State University in Milan. So here we have great diversity because we have one person from Florence instead of two, the other two from Milan. Lorenza was educated not only in Italy but also in Germany and here in the United States, where she did a Master of Law at the University of Illinois, just nearby in Champaign-Urbana. She teaches and writes in the fields of human rights, comparative law, constitutional law, and she has been the head of the Department of Italian and Supranational Law at the State University, as well as director of the departments of public law, civil procedure, international and European law, all at the same university. She is a member of the management board of the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights and the Scientific Committee for the Family of the Lombardy region and the Union of Catholic Jurists. Professor Violini's recent works include Human Dignity and the Right to Life, published with Marilena Genusa just last year, and Legal Traditions in Dialogue, Elementary Experience Tested by Diversity, a volume that three of us here have participated in, and finally, Bioethics and Laicity in 2008. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests and in opening up this conversation on poverty and European experience.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for your presentation. I'm impressed by all the titles and all the elements you have stressed. Thank you very much indeed. My paper is expected to be connected with Andrea Simoncini one, but in fact we hadn't time to discuss a lot, so in a sense they are independent, though we share the same title. I am a sociologist, so I can try to offer interpretation moving from a gospel world. For you always have the poor with you. This intriguing and in some respect obscure evangelical expression may in fact have different meanings. What does it mean? Why are we alerted about this company? Should we look at poverty as an inevitable and necessary evil? Sad to say, too often the gospel words has been used to induce a sense of resignation among the poor and the cheerful liability among the rich. But there is a different meaning useful to be recalled here. You always have the poor with you means that poor represent the inverted mirror of the social world. That is, by looking at poverty, we can discover the faulty side of the social organization, and so have the opportunity to change it. Why so? Because poverty is the result of the most diverse forms of individual selfishness and indifferences taking place in a specific society. Forms which become often invisible, being entrenched with everyday life, social practices, institutional configurations. If so, the gospel urges us to look at the poor as a place of revelation, of truth. In fact, I don't have them.
You don't.
Okay. In fact, they allow us to understand that the world we have built and in which we have our own place, despite all our efforts and goodwill, produces negative consequences. Approaching poverty is thus a way society may follow to recognize the chain stretched by their own contradiction. Without despising achievements in terms of personal and collective life, poverty calls for a more truly humanized world. For this reason, the poor are a prophetic place where we always need to look at if we want to go ahead, to make progress. This dynamism can be clearly recognized looking back at the historical development. Many of the accomplishments we are proud of, private property, democracy, welfare regimes, all derivation of the notion of human dignity, has been reached as a reply to the provocation stemmed from poverty. After all, I believe, this is one of the hallmarks Christianity produced over Western culture. Indeed, poverty is always first and foremost a personal matter, relating to and affecting a single human life. But it's always a social fact too, inasmuch as it involves human, social, and institutional dimensions. As Paul Ricoeur put it, justice proceeds by conceptual reduction, love proceeds by poetic amplification. This issue needs to be addressed by declining in an intelligent and interconnected way the level of charity and the place of justice that cannot ever be separated from each other. But before taking the institutional implication, as Andrea Simoncini will do, let me start from a sociological sketch on the four roots, so to say, which I consider at the origin of the contemporary poverty in Europe. I begin by saying that the 1989-2008 period was characterized by an expansive logic. In those years, an unrestrained rise of possibilities and opportunities in all the spheres of human life, economically, financially, geographically, technologically, subjectively, conducted not to a decrease, but to an increase in the concentration of wealth and consequently in inequality and injustice. Well before the crisis, though even more strongly since 2008, wealth and power have been increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small group getting richer, while a growing part of the population experienced a greater exposition to insecurity, vulnerability, and at the end, poverty. This is true within every single country as well as among countries. The contradiction exploded with the crisis. For instance, in Italy, and the data is impressive, the number of the absolute poor doubled from 2007 to 2013, from 2.4 million to 6 million, about 10% of the population. The same is true for Greece or Spain. But also in the United States, the situation worsened in the last few years. For instance, child poverty in America is at its highest point in 20 years, putting millions of children at increased risk of injuries, infant mortality, and premature death. 25% of children don't have enough food to eat, and 7 million kids still don't have health insurance. The share of wealth of the bottom 90% of family did gradually increase from 15% in the 20s to a peak of 36% in the mid-80s, and then dramatically declined. By 2012, the bottom 90% collectively owns only 23% of the total US wealth, about as much as in the 40s. That is to say, this is the point, that the access to the benefits of the economic growth, especially but not only when the economy does not run, remained an open question in advanced societies. It cannot be given for granted. Education, on one hand, and redistributive policies, on the other, as McIntyre put yesterday, remain the tools to be used in order to fight poverty. Contrary to contemporary assumption, the fight against poverty, especially after the economic takeoff, has not simply to do with the rate of economic growth. Looking at the state of our economies and societies and the stalemate we have reached in reducing poverty, which is with a stable oscillation of around 15% of the population since the 70s, at stake there is not just a delay on the roadmap, but the modification of the plan of the journey. Though important these issues are, it's not just a matter of inequality and redistribution, of course. A second recurrent problem stems from an expansion which simply enlarges the quantity of goods and opportunities available. An expansion for the sake of expansion, which fuels a purely performative logic. It's the lack of any direction, the loss of any sense, what is at stake here. At the social level, this radicalizes the unresolved disequilibrium between the wealth we produce and our social needs, between the overall productive capacity of advanced economies and the employment rates, between technological advancements and educational structures and investments. The common sense is that inevitably there are human costs to be paid in order to reach development. It's natural that a proportion of humans sustain heavy human cost as a side effect of its economic growth. In fact, by separating the economy from society, the result was the creation of what Bauman defined as wasted lives. As a matter of fact, the contemporary globalized economy produces a humanity on the edge. That is, various forms of social storage which are becoming more and more explosive, from the banlieue of the megacities abandoned to informality and self-organization, to the centers for legal and illegal migrants across the borders, often reduced to ghettos inadequate in every respect to the human host. From the long-term unemployed to school dropouts, contemporary world produces an enormous amount of human waste. As Bauman concludes, oversupply is like a specter among the inhabitants of the liquid modern world. Though powerful, contemporary civilization still remains characterized by excess, oversupply, scrap, and disposal of waste. And being on excess is one of the forms taken by poverty nowadays. Paradoxically, the system grows fast, but poverty does not decrease. The gap is filled by enlarging the risk of poverty for those who do not meet the criteria, do not get the requirements, do not fall into the categories defined by social desirability. At the personal level, living in an expansive context without any direction involves the awareness of the self, to quote a title by Alan Ehrenberg. In a highly competitive society, poverty has often to do with the failure to perform due to the lack of capability but also of motivation. Under this respect, contemporary poverty may be viewed as a deficit of success, a reminder of the Procrustean bed, the left behind in the race for profit and performance. A third root should be found in the consequences of the unreasonable weakening of all the social relations from the family onwards, which have heavy consequences on the effective recognition of personal needs, beliefs, and abilities. This is an effect of a contemporary culture according to which social bonds can generally be regarded as limitation on individual freedom. Such a radicalized individualism, by cutting all social bonds, ends up by producing injustice and, at the end, impoverishment. This has given rise to the influential idea that creating a just society means conceding all subjects a form of self-determination that allows them to become as much independent as possible from their partners in interaction. Loneliness and the frying of social bonds produced by such an individualistic culture are associated with the new forms of poverty, which in fact very often involve separated parents, single mothers, the elderly, single-income families. The loss of community resources and the weakening of all forms of practical wisdom are associated with the spread of an anesthetic space based on appearance, consumption, emotions. Therefore, poverty in advanced society is not only the consequence of a loss in purchasing power. More profoundly, it has to do with the scarcity of personal skill and social relation, being those two aspects closely interrelated. Bernard Stiegler talks of a new form of proletarization, being alone and separated by institutional as well as social networks that's being radically singularized. It involves the loss of the know-how and consequently the economic as well as social and cultural marginalization. This means going in the opposite direction with respect to Martin Nussbaum and Amartya Sen's notion of capability, that is the ability to perform or achieve certain action and outcomes through a set of controllable and measurable faculties, features, functions, processes, or services. As these two scholars made clear, education and vitality of social relation at the grassroots level are essential conditions to make personal skills effective. Last but not least, the fourth root of contemporary poverty is the externalization of the moral action to the state as the only agent legitimized to realize justice. This idea involves the complex institutionalization of the fight against poverty, which is simply a duty of the state, and therefore the reduction of the social and personal mobilization needed to fight impoverishment. And yet, a purely bureaucratic approach is unable to solve the problem. On the contrary, it paradoxically contributes to recreate poverty. Take, for instance, the case of Finland, one of the European countries in which welfare state regime is more advanced. From the 90s, poverty in Finland doubled. Today, there are about 800,000 people who ask for help in a country often portrayed as the best country in the world to live in, as the Newsweek wrote a few years ago. Yet this perfection is precisely what is likely to blow up. If we work about welfare all in terms of economic effects, the reality is divided into categories. In Finland, the state guarantees a lot of aid, but this aid does not work as it should. Why? Part of the problem depends on its own, and surprisingly, by the fact that the services are too efficient. But too efficient, according to economic logic, also means too specialized. This problem worsened because of the financial restrictions. In recent years, the government introduced some cuts, yet cuts increase fragmentation, impairing the quality of services and even their effectiveness. The problem is that in this perfect welfare, there are too many specialists to deal with the problems of a single person. A woman or a man have a problem, send him to the psychologist, then to the behavioral therapist, then to the doctor, and finally to the psychiatrist. The problem is that, in the meantime, between one point and the other, the person is alone and suffers his loneliness. The Finnish experience, which beyond poverty has high rates of alcoholism and suicide, suggests that economic resources are necessary but not sufficient to eradicate poverty in advanced societies. This is because poverty is foremost a human matter which concerns the entire person. An excessive specialization of services and even too many economic resources may become a problem because the life of a person is not disassembled and reassembled at will. On the contrary, professionalism in social services should be broad spectrum. The problem of those who are in troubles cannot be solved by a short appointment every 3 weeks. This means exclude them rather than support them. By undermining the trust which is at the core of the social bond, the idea that social assistance is a right which has nothing to do with my own personal contribution and thus to the responsibility to implement justice is a matter concerning only this constitutional state, The administrative welfare reaches a paradoxical result. Security and social integration are worsening not only by economic reason, but also by the same institution devoted to reinforce them. Now, the crisis is certainly painful for many, especially in Europe. Indeed, poverty affects a growing part of the population, particularly among the young generation. And this is a challenge for all of us. Certainly, we need economic growth, but the problem is, what kind of growth? What sort of prosperity? As the history teaches, we cannot find a way out without recognizing the lessons of the crisis. The problem is not just to turn the engine on. The difficulties are more serious nowadays. Approaching poverty is a way to learn what should be learned in front of the contradictory world we live in, where the poor become poorer and the rich lose their lives in search of something that they will not find. How we can get out from this cul-de-sac? First of all, remember the gospel lesson. Look at the poor. Don't be afraid of them. Don't remove them from your sight. Interestingly, it's always the same suggested from the Bible. Listen, Israel. This is look at reality. Discover what it tries to suggest. What the four roots mentioned before share is the vision of individual liberty in terms of autonomy, where autonomy is defined as a certain type of individual relation to self that allows him to be confident of his needs and beliefs and to value his own capabilities. I would suggest instead that the precondition to step over the contradiction we experience in contemporary world, and in Europe especially, is the recognition of poverty as a lack of autonomy, as a common aspect of our own human condition. As a matter of fact, contemporary culture denies the simple fact that the human beings are vulnerable to many kinds of affliction, and that this vulnerability cannot be eliminated. As McIntyre put it, we are rational, dependent animals. This is essential in order to define in a different way the idea of the common good, as well as the ways to pursue it. I quote, "What I'm trying to envisage then is a form of political society in which it's taken for granted that disability and dependence on others are something that all of us experience at certain times in our lives, and this to unpredictable degrees, and that consequently our interest is how the needs of the disabled are adequately voiced and met is not a special interest of a particular group, but rather the interest of the whole political society, an interest that is integral to their conception of common good." Interestingly, this was exactly the point raised by Emmanuel Mounier in the 40s. I quote, "Reducing freedom solely to the conquest of autonomy is to encourage the rigidity of the individual. The movement of freedom is also relaxation, permeability, availability. It's not only a rupture, a conquest, it's also, in the end, acceptance. The free man is the man the world questions and who answers. He is responsible man." Contrary to contemporary individualistic assumption, we achieve autonomy only along intersubjective paths, by learning to understand ourselves via others' recognition. If individual autonomy is to emerge and flourish, reciprocal intersubjective recognition is required. Axel Honneth put it as, "It does not suffice to conceive autonomy as arising solely from intersubjective respect for subject decision-making competence. Rather, subjects need to be appreciated for their particular needs and individual deeds." This is the theoretical point we have to focus on nowadays. To step forward, the economic and social development involves the overcome of a pure individualistic idea of the human being and the adoption of relational conception, which, for different reasons, neither the market nor the state, by their own, are able to sustain. Poverty has certainly to do with material condition, but as the four roots I mentioned in my presentation show, this aspect is always deeply entrenched with personal, relational, and cultural aspects. In a time when our social and personal problems do not depend primarily on scarcity of means, poverty as the way of life that makes us sober by the recognition of our constitutive dependency may help us to regain the sense of life and the richness of our relationship. Having separated the individual, entitled to abstract economic and political rights from the moral duty of justice, our society creates the kind of poverty we have. The commitment is just to stimulate the regeneration of social bonds, strengthening those that exist, encouraging the creation of new ones. Beginning with the family, seen as a living and original organism with the capacity of contributing to the weaving of the fabric of social relation. Beyond the market and the state, the personal contribution, as well as the role played by local communities and relational contact networks are still essential. For you always have the poor with you. All these considerations may clarify the gospel words, as well as why Pope Francis urges Christians to move towards the existential peripheries. To cope with poverty, institutional reform and economic rationalization will not be enough, unless we put in question the predatory gaze, always looking for new opportunities to be exploited, which is typical of contemporary individuals. In the perspective, poverty is simply the condition to make room, is the route towards beauty, the space for the sacred, the symbol instead of the idol. Poverty, not misery, in fact, creates an empty space which is essential to become aware of our own limitation, of our dependent nature, as individuals as well as societies, opening the way for trust and faith. From this point of view, poverty is not just something to be eradicated. It's also a method, a larger premise of fullness, a condition of freedom. Etymologically, poor, pauper, combines paucus, little, and parvus, small. It thus means modesty, humility, awareness of the limit. That is recognition of interdependence, grace, and gratitude.
I also want to thank Paolo for his introduction. I was thinking that the introduction here in United States are quite different than the Italian ones, because you are so analytical, you say a lot of things. So my self-esteem here always getting increased after the presentation here in the United States. And also Paolo for his wonderful words, but also the Center for Culture and Ethics for having invited me, and so giving the possibility of discussing with a lot of colleagues, but also to see a lot of deep and good friends. So my presentation, as Mauro was saying, is under the same title of Mauro's presentation, because my attempt is trying to see how Mauro's sociological analysis can affect constitutional theory, mainly in European constitutional theory and practice, and mainly under the specific idea of what we call constitutional personalism. So what is poverty? Who is the poor? There are two opposite ways we heard to answer this question. On the one hand, we can consider the poor as a special category of people. A good example of this approach is the definition of poverty elaborated by the World Bank. According to that definition, poverty is a pronounced deprivation in well-being affecting those persons or households who don't have enough income or consumption to put them above some adequate minimum threshold. Understood in this way, poverty is a social phenomenon we can measure according to certain minimum thresholds, and consequently the poor are a specific, wider or narrower part of the population. As we heard, there is, however, another broader and I think more meaningful way to understand poverty that considers poor every man who is lacking and then is in need of something necessary to her dignity. In this perspective, every man is poor because every living human being needs other than himself to live a decent and dignified life. Hence, moving from this idea, the aim of as we heard from Mauro, the aim of the total eradication of poverty appears as utopian as the idea of a totally self-made man. And probably now we could better understand that quite mysterious passage of the gospel when Jesus says, "You will always have the poor with you." Obviously, we will always keep on fighting against the economic or the cultural poverty or other kinds of deprivations. But we can never cut the dependence itself, which is co-essential to the human being. In this perspective, as we say, let's say provokingly in our title or presentation, the very famous Constitution preamble of the American Constitution, "We the people," should be rather understood as "we the poor." I believe that this second perspective is much more comprehensive and convincing if we apply it to the field of social and, moreover, legal sciences. However, before examining the constitutional consequences, I'd like to quickly draw your attention on the sources of this idea of poverty and the related conception of public authority. Obviously, this approach is not philosophically neutral, but relying on a specific anthropological background that usually is dated back to the very origin of the ancient political and moral philosophy, recalling the political animal, the zoon politikon of Aristotle and Aquinas. Surely I don't want to deny such important ancestors, but I think we can find some more recent and probably interesting approaches to human experience confirming the main claim of that anthropological foundation. That is, man is ontologically poor, than is always in need of. I'd like simply to sketch out some of these different approaches, recalling, let's say, three witnesses. The first one, as also Mauro had, is Alasdair MacIntyre. The second is Luigi Giussani. The third is David Brooks. Three very different authors, but with one point in common: this departure for the concrete human experience. Professor MacIntyre, that is one of the philosophical stars of this conference, said in the book that Mauro quoted, Dependent Rational Animals, something about moral philosophy that can be perfectly applied to present-day constitutional law. He said, if it is most often to others that we owe our survival, this dependence or particular others for protection and sustenance is most obvious in the early childhood and in old age. But between these first and last stages of our lives are characteristically marked by longer or shorter periods of injury, illness, or other disablement. These two related set of facts, those concerning our vulnerabilities and afflictions and those concerning the extent of our dependence on particular others, are so evidently of singular importance that it might seem that no account of the human condition whose authors hoped to achieve credibility could avoid giving them a central place. Yet, the history of Western moral philosophy suggests otherwise. Well, despite the same set of facts about vulnerability and dependence, also the history of Western constitutional law suggests completely otherwise. It suggests that the role of law is increasingly to cut off any kind of relations from the birth to death, to deny vulnerability, to remove that we owe to someone or to something other our flourishing or even survival. Autonomy as self-determination today seems the most relevant, we should say, the super constitutional value. The second witness is Luigi Giussani. I have already had the opportunity of discussing some of Luigi Giussani's ideas here in a previous edition of this conference, and I think that it is still useful, his idea of human elementary experience, to give an account for the anthropological background of this concept of poverty we are trying to advance. What is his idea of elementary experience? Here you have this passage, I quote from The Religious Sense. It can be described as a complex of needs and evidences which accompany us as we come face to face with all that exists. These needs can be given many names. The need for goodness, justice, truth, and happiness constitutes man's ultimate identity. So according to Giussani's anthropological and pedagogical approach, humanity, that is what characterizes and differentiates human beings from other living species, only emerges in the impact with reality. In this sense, it is an experience. In this impact, the elementary, that is the first and deepest perception, is that man is made by findings and needs. Humans have called these needs by many names: pursuit of happiness, truth, goodness, justice. But if we consider all these values, happiness, goodness, justice, before to be ideals, they are very concrete needs of every man and woman. In this sense, all human beings, if they move from their elementary experience, are poor. The real man, in his concrete experience, is always begging. The third reference is to David Brooks, that is neither a philosopher nor an academic, he's a journalist, and according to me, a very intelligent observer of contemporary way of living. In one of his more recent books, The Social Animal, he explores the consequences of, let's say, the new frontier of scientific research about humans, what we call neurosciences. He says that we have learned more about the human brain the last 30 years than we had in the previous 3,000s. It is what Brooks names the cognitive revolution. Well, this cognitive revolution demonstrated that human being emerges out of relationships. Therefore, the health of a society is determined by the health of those relationships, not by the extent to which it maximizes individual choices. As the author observes in that book, this very simple evidence has a tremendous impact on the same idea of poverty, as far as we realize that the key factor in the flourishing of a person is not his or her income, but the kind of relations he or she can establish. The economic conditions plays a role, if any, only insofar as it changes the kind of relational environment the person will live in, and not because it empowers her individual choice or consumption. So, moving from these anthropological premises, what can we say about the constitutional architecture of the state? And my point of view, as you say, is the history of the contemporary European constitutions. In Europe, we have had two subsequent constitutional waves. The first one at the end of the 18th century and the second after the World War II. The first constitutional season was triggered by two great revolutions on the opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, the French and the American, both characterized by two almost coeval constitutional documents, the 1787 American Constitution and the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens. While here, on the North American continent, you still have enforced that original constitution, if obviously deeply amended and integrated by the years, on the European continent, all the 18th century constitutions have been swept away by the two world wars, and moreover by the experience of the totalitarian regimes that practically annihilated every sort of constitutional democracy in the continental Europe, with the exception of Great Britain. So after the World War II, an entirely new constitutional wave was restarted. One of the distinctive features of those new post-war constitutions was that they all addressed the issue of poverty. Contemporary European constitutions are characterized by a concrete understanding of man and accordingly of rights, in the sense that the state is not simply, in this European constitutional theory, a democratic lawmaker and an independent rule enforcer, given that the very same rule applies in a totally different way to a rich man and to a poor one. One symbolic moment in this constitutional change was the famous speech held by the American President Franklin Roosevelt in 1941, when he affirmed as essential to human liberties also the freedom from want. As we know, this idea highly affected after the drafting of 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations and the formulation of Article 25, the right to an adequate standard of living. So the new European constitutions are explicitly committed to help poor people, but moving from which concept of poverty and consequently how do they deal with it? If we look at the result of the European constitutional history, we should say it has been clearly affected by the first idea of poverty I tried to sketch out. Poverty is a social phenomenon characterized mainly by its economic or welfare dimension and affecting a particular sector of population. Consequently, during the second half of the 20th century, the winning strategy has been to provide poor people what they need. The ideal coming from the previous century was Bismarck. The logical result was the growth of the state as service provider, directly or through state-owned enterprises. And this leads us to the present-day paradox of a welfare state which has become poor to fight poverty, killed by the statist vicious circle More poverty requires more state requires more taxes creates more poverty. However, as we said at the beginning, in the post-war constitutional debate, there was also a different way to consider this question, moving from a different anthropological premise. This different perspective was represented mainly by the Christian political philosophy and the Catholic social doctrine. It was what we call in political terms personalistic constitutionalism, or more in philosophical terms, simply personalism, well represented by French and Italian thinkers like Jacques Maritain, Emmanuel Mounier, or Giorgio Lapira, Aldo Moro, Giuseppe Dossetti. This constitutional doctrine moved from the notion, certainly amplified by the war and by the experience of totalitarian regimes, of the human being as structurally poor, because vulnerable and always needing of something other than himself to be fulfilled. Until today, one of the most typical examples of this personalistic constitutions is the Italian Constitution of 1948. The main pillar of the Italian Constitution is Article 2 in the brand new translation provided by Paolo Carozza. Because we are working on text of constitution, but this is another story, where we can read, the Republic recognizes and guarantees the inviolable rights of the man, both as an individual and in the social groups where his personality is expressed, and requires to fulfill the underogable duties of political, economic, and social solidarity. As we teach to all Italian law school students, this article has two decisive meanings. Firstly, it says that the Republic recognizes rights of man. Therefore, the state doesn't create, neither simply guarantee human rights, but it recognizes them. That is to say, the rights of the people are pre-existing the public power. And this is a clear reference to natural law theory. Accordingly, the state can always regulate those rights to make them more effective, but can never eliminate them. Secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, it says that the Italian Republic recognizes the rights of man as individual and in the social groups where his personality is expressed and requires to fulfill the duties. Here you find an original and probably unique for the time being bi-dimensional idea of the fundamental rights. Constitutional rights are not only legal tools aiming to protect the individual, but their scope is also to protect social groups, that is, social relations, indispensable to human beings to be truly human. Therefore, the area of fundamental rights granted to the individuals is the same area granted to human relations and associations. And reversely, it can be prohibited to the associations only what can be either prohibited to individuals. Following that idea, the second part of Article 2, very often the forgotten part of the legal theory in Italy, is devoted to the duties, saying that the Republic, while it recognizes fundamental rights, requires to fulfill the inderogable duties of solidarity. The idea behind constitutional personalism is that the Republic has to protect fundamental rights not only as individual claims, but also as social relations. So to make these rights effective, the state must activate first and foremost the individual and social responsibility, that is, the duty of solidarity. In this sense, the principle of subsidiarity elaborated in the 19th century within the Catholic social doctrine, even if not expressly mentioned, is implicitly evoked here. The state has firstly to require everyone to exercise his duty of mutual solidarity, and the public power can intervene only subsidiarily, that is, only insofar as the social responsibility demonstrates either to be insufficient or ineffective. How this personalistic approach would affect the way the state deals with poverty? We know that one of the main differences between American 18th century constitutions and European 20th century constitutional documents is the existence of the so-called social rights. In the Italian constitution, as in other European constitutions, you may find provisions quite unfamiliar to an American lawyer, constitutional lawyer mainly. We have the constitutional right to have a job, the constitutional right to education, the constitutional right to health care, social security, trial defense, adequate salary, or to have adequate means to live in case of unemployment, and so on. Those rights are attempts to cope with the vulnerability of human beings. Thus, in our words, they derive from the ontological poverty of man and aim to reduce some concrete dimensions of that poverty. Anyhow, we must be aware that social rights narrative is totally different within an individualistic and personalistic frame. Within an individualistic perspective, social rights are either completely meaningless, as argue, for example, the extreme libertarians, or the only possible way to give them a concrete meaning is to consider social rights as entitlements to social services. Whenever the market fails to provide those social services at affordable prices, the state has to step in and furnish the social services. This is, in great synthesis, the story of almost all European constitutions, especially in the northern European states, where the influence of Reformation and its emphasis on the individual has been greater. In all these countries, we have had a remarkable increase of the so-called welfare state. Within the personalistic perspective, the foundation of social rights is totally different. As in the Italian Constitution shows, social rights are not first and foremost entitlements to social services, but entitlement to social relations. The most important social rights, job, education, healthcare, social security, are nothing more than human wants whose real answer is a relationship. The answer to the need of education is the relation with the teacher, and through the teacher, the relation to knowledge of reality. The answer to the need of healthcare is the relation with a doctor or a nurse. The answer to search of job is the relation with an employer, or the access to market if you are already an entrepreneur. So in a personalistic perspective, social rights are rights to relations before then rights to services. Social groups where the human personality flourishes are entitled to fundamental rights just as individuals. I'd like to conclude giving a more concrete perception of this different approach to welfare rights. Let's consider a quite recent decision in the Italian Constitutional Court, the Judgment 203/2013. In this case, the Constitutional Court was asked to review a law, a certain legislative decree, that allows the relatives of severely disabled person to benefit of a leave of absence in order to assist them. According to the regulation under scrutiny of the court, an enumerated list of relatives, this one, of a disabled person, father, mother, step-parents, brother, sister, wife, or husband, either linked to a legal marriage or simply cohabitants, can benefit of the leave of absence from work and receive from the state an indemnity related to their salary. The question submitted to the court was about the constitutionality of that law, insofar as it does not include within the class of persons entitled of the benefit also other cohabitants related to disabled by birth or marriage within the third degree, whenever there are no other possible persons obviously available to care for the disabled person. The answer of the court is a good example of this personalistic constitutionalism. The answer of the court has been yes. The court stated that in the Italian constitutional system requires the most effective protection of persons in need, and that such protection includes, firstly, their right to enjoy human relations. Consequently, people with disabilities had the right to be assisted by their family members, and therefore the limitations of the category relatives was unconstitutional. The court says in the decision, stressing the essential role of the family in the provision of assistance and socialization of the disabled, the court wishes to highlight the fact that in order to ensure full protection for the weak, it is necessary to provide not only healthcare services and rehabilitation, but also care and social inclusion, and, above all, to ensure continuity within the constitutive relationship of human personality. This decision shows clearly this notion of social rights underlying the Italian Constitution and reveals a relational conception of the individual and his rights. Within that conception, the more effective way to deal with poverty is, first of all, to guarantee the possibility for a person of enjoying those relationships necessary to a dignified life. But the most interesting point we can learn from this example is that this way of reasoning is not only more humanly sound, but also economically more efficient, given that the public expenditure for indemnities of caregivers is immensely lower than the creation and management of healthcare facilities. Conclusion. I think that in the present-day situation characterized by a deadly financial crisis of welfare states and by the progressive weakening of any kind of civil cohesion, it could be extremely useful to switch our public debate from the right talk to the need talk, to use Jeremy Waldron's image. We the poor as a constitutional foundation means a realistic gaze to the people which constitutes a society, means the awareness that to cut off any kind of dependency instead of obtaining a stronger individual generates a weaker and fragmented person, totally powerless in front of the state, the ultimate rights giver. Thank you.
How long are we going to be? How long is it?
We have until 12.
Until 12. Ah, 20 minutes, exactly. Okay. Okay, so thanks a lot to Paolo. Yes, this is me. Thanks a lot to Paolo, and thanks a lot to all the friends here in Notre Dame, and especially to the people from the center, to whom I am bound to a very deep friendship, and a lot of help also in my profession. So my presentation will deal with three aspects of European policy against poverty, and is divided in three parts. Some data about poverty within the European Union, the historical development of European programs in the field, and the present state of the art with speaking about the European investments for fighting poverty. The first, wait, okay, great. It's a little bit, you need to. This first slide is a perfect documentation of what we have heard before, that is, we always have the poor with you. Because in Europe right now, we have, by 2012, 24.2 million people, that is the 24.8 almost 1/4 of the population of the Union at 28 countries, who lives at risk of poverty or social inclusion. This means that they are affected by at least one of the conditions measured. Can you please try to echo? No, wait. Okay. Can you do something? It's a little small. Okay.
Is that still?
No, not really. Okay, but more or less.
You want to signal to me when you want to change it?
But, it's up to you. Okay, this means that those people, those 125 million people, are affected by one of the following characteristics. They are at least of poverty, meaning that they live with an income below 60% of the national median equalized income after social transfer. They are severely materially deprived, and let me give you an idea of what does it mean. Okay, severe material deprivation means for Europe, for the European Union, that you lack one of the four of the 9 items. So if you don't have one of those 4 items, you are severe materially deprived, which can be discussed in fact, or, and which is another interesting indicator. Let me see if it works. Okay, if we live in a household with low work intensity, meaning that there are adults where adults work less than 20% of their total work potential during the year. The impact of the economic crisis on poverty has been significant. Almost 3 million more people were at risk of poverty or social exclusion in 2012 compared to 2011. And another characteristic of poverty in Europe is the strong differentiation of poverty within member states. No, I'm going back, excuse me. Okay. So Bulgaria has a 49% of poor people, whereas Netherlands have 15%. So the variation is very strong. What happened in the past to cope with poverty in Europe? I will touch 3 points again. The first steps, the Treaty of Amsterdam and the strategy, the Lisbon strategy. Wait, okay. The present size of poverty in Europe is so high that it cannot be ignored any longer, even though, in principle, the European Union is not fully competent for social policies, but only for creating a single market. This is what is written in the founding treaties, and yet, from its own set, Europe was well aware, due also to the personalism that is part of the European culture in constitutional and international law, was well aware that one cannot deal with economic policies without reference to social policy. The Messina Declaration that you have on the slide, 1955, begins with a statement that, I quote, "The establishment of a united Europe must be achieved through the development of common institutions, the progressive fusion of national economies, the creation of a common market, and the gradual harmonization of their social policies." Despite this very prophetic awareness, the first treaties in the 70s provided the European institutions with social functions only when they were related to harmonizing the employment and living standards, strictly finalizing them to the free movement of workers and persons, so nothing to do with poverty. Therefore, from the beginning to the 90s, European social policy was an area where EU powers were weak and its program sometimes challenged by member states. See what happens there, founding treaty. Okay, these are my three points. Let me give you an example. In 1972, at the Paris summit, the heads of state and government started fostering the community social dimension by establishing a European social action program. Afterwards, 3 European anti-poverty programs were put in place, financing micro-projects and research in the area, and they worked relatively good. And yet, the 4th program in the early 90s was not implemented because of disagreement about the role of the European institution in fighting poverty. The Commission then decided to use part of the budget to directly fund 86 projects to fight social exclusion. But following this decision, the United Kingdom government seized the European Court of Justice for annulment of the decision by the European Constitution. Then the ECJ judged that the Commission was not competent to fund projects for fighting social exclusion. And this attitude, this distrust of some member states toward the Commission when it enacts a program to fight poverty is partially alive up to now. In 2011, the European judiciary struck down a food program based on European competence in the area of common agricultural policy. Such a decision was highly contested by all the food banks in Europe because they led them on the edge of bankruptcy. No help anymore from Europe, and the distribution of food in all European countries was highly deprived. And I will come back to this decision later on. The second step, Amsterdam and the open method of cooperation. The turning point was, as it is well known, the signing of the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997-1999. Here, social policies became a part of European competence, but they have to be designed and implemented under the joint responsibility of the European Community and the member states. They have to work together. In other words, the new treaty granted the Union explicit competencies in the field of social exclusion, along with social security and social protection of workers, but only through the so-called open method of coordination or cooperation. And in the social field, this means that you have to set up a mutual process of planning, examination, comparison, and adjustment of social policies of the member states, and all of this on the basis of common objectives. So the task of combating poverty became officially part of the European field of action. And shortly after, in 2000, the Lisbon European Council considered that, I quote, modernizing the European social model, investing in people and combating social exclusion was part of the overall strategy that was needed to reach the strategic goals for the next decade. And such goals are put down in the so-called Lisbon strategy, aiming to make Europe by 2010 the most competitive and most dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. So this was a very high standard, and this standard was not achieved. In 2010, the Commission itself acknowledged that, I will put, I try to cope with time constraint, so the failure of the state, this is a European Union report, says that in general it may be stated that regardless of the effect of the crisis, the quantitative achievements of the Lisbon strategy have been inconsistent. Some member states and so on, but what I want to point out is exactly the last sentence. Some indicators in the social sphere indicate at the very least a level of stagnation, with indicators regarding the risk of poverty being especially worrying. So somehow Europe had failed. And we can ask ourselves why this happens. And I think that what was said by the previous speakers is very clearly show why. When you put economics on the top and you don't try to focus on social relationship and on welfare, it is very difficult that you can achieve good goals. But since people learn from their failures sometimes, the new strategy, the European 2020 strategy, okay, ecco, no, this one, first one, has changed perspective. Huh? The strategy is about delivering growth that is smart, through more effective investment in education, research and innovation, sustainable, thanks to a decisive move toward a low-carbon economy, but inclusive, with a strong emphasis on job creation and poverty reduction. And this strategy, let me see if I can find sometimes even this technical devices work. The strategy focused on 5 specific goals that you have on the slides. And I want to, of course, stress the 4th one, meaning that Europe would like to reduce poverty by at least 20 million fewer people in the EU. So it's a very high goal that Europe aims at achieving. But what is the important change that I want to stress and to show to you is the following one. We have such a people, no? Again. This is something that Europe has decided to do and has somehow imposed to member states. That is 20% of European social fund earmarked for fighting poverty and social exclusion. So it's not anymore only a coordination, planning, research, and common objective, a very general type of strategy. It's a specific commitment for states to use European money in a certain way, which is a radical change in the European perspective, because the open method of coordination usually always try to negotiate and find a middle way in different perspectives. But now Europe has taken a clear position, and I think that this is very important to put under observation, to and also to consider an important step ahead. So what member states have to do is that they are somehow free to frame their own programs to achieve this goal, but yet they are bound to make projects and programs that respect the minimum share of investments in social policies aiming at fighting poverty. I should also point out that this positive aspect of the new strategy is part of a process that has been just begun. In October 2014, the Commission has approved 27 out of 28 national partnership agreements that are the outcome of a series of negotiations with member states. In those agreements, member states and the Commission negotiate as the true priorities and to the targets to be achieved by the states. And the states, in turn, have to negotiate with regions and local authorities in order to identify programs that will allow to achieve the targets. As you can imagine, this is a long and cumbersome process. It is consistent with the subsidiarity principle in a vertical sense, and is probably the only way to cope with the strong diversity in poverty rates among member states. But on the other hand, it runs the risk of being ineffective, as it was the strategy of Lisbon. This is a risk Europe cannot afford to run anymore due to the difficult situation it is facing as to poverty and social inclusion. In a sense, this bound to use part of the funds for that goal is very important and very new. And another aspect of the current situation of the European fight against Europe is a new program that was approved in March 2014. And this is a response, exactly a response to that case where the judiciary said that the Commission was not entitled to finance programs to fight poverty. No? So seeing the problematic effects of this decision, member states within the Council, not the Commission anymore, but all the member states, agreed to offer to the state themselves a new program called Fund for European Aid to the Most Deprived. And this was done in response to that judgment. The fund will be worth 3.8 billion euros for the 7-year periods, and Europe think to help with those money approximately 4 million people, which is the estimate number of homeless people present in Europe. So, to conclude this very fast overview over our policy in Europe, I should say that now we face a situation where we have a big strategy, because the European Social Fund for 7 years amount of 80 billion euros, the 20% of them has to be used to fight poverty. So we have a big strategy, very difficult to be put in place, but very interesting for getting to the targets Europe would like to achieve. And on the same time, we combine this big approach to a very specific one. Not everyone is poor, as we have heard before. There are people that are really in need, homeless, no food, no clothes. And for them, member states receive money and are committed to co-finance specific help to them. Of course, this is not the only thing we can do to cope with poverty. We have heard that we should have a broader perspective, even in institutional policy design. But nonetheless, I think that this can be a good help for people that are in need and in poverty. Thank you. Perfetto, vado a capo. Sono stata precisa?
Sì, siedi qui per le domande.
Ah, certo.
So we have only a few minutes, but there is a little bit of a margin with lunch that I think we can take, at least gather a few comments and questions. We'll take them all as a group and let each of our panelists then provide some concluding comments in response to those that they'd like. Yes?
Yeah, hi, Patrick Kenny, Notre Dame. I'm actually really sympathetic with the argument that Mauro and Andrea offered to us. And I want to believe that there is, in particular, within the European tradition, a very rich development of Catholic social thought that we could see evidence for in the way in which Europeans now live, particularly in comparison, speaking as an American, in comparison to in the American context, in which we have a much stronger, I think, a much more deeply embedded philosophical and cultural and social political emphasis upon individualism, something that Tocqueville notices when he arrives here. And so one would expect then to see a society in America of radically individuated, autonomous, self-seeking persons, and in Europe a rich sort of social atmosphere of people who are richly embedded in communities, in families and associations and churches. But in fact what we see in evidence, in sociological evidence, is that there's a much higher presence of family creation, voluntary membership in associations, religious affiliation, that still persists in America, although it's dropping in the United States. And so there seems to be a kind of disconnection between the philosophy and theory that you're offering that I think is much more richly embedded in Europe and the actual practice that we seem to see in evidence in comparing the American and European context. So can you in any way explain what should be a very different kind of set of social outcomes?
Thank you. Let's see if there's some other questions first before we continue. Yeah.
I would follow up on this because that it's deeply connected with what we asked. As a European, I would say, given the presentation, that we are all set when it comes to legal framework. I mean, Andrea showed us that we have a junior solidarity, it's understanding proper understanding of the role relationship, human relationship, as being crucial, and understanding needs. And Lorenza said that we are doing a better job at the European level. But I was struck by Mauro's portrait of what poverty means and the challenges that it poses. And it looks like we have deferred the challenge to law. So who's going to address the challenge? Law and the economy and the welfare system. So my question will be for the sociologists here, and it will be, who's the subject who must recognize the value of poverty? So you said we must recognize the value of the whole situation. And this goes back to the question, because it looks like here society recognizes that and therefore triggers a lot of initiatives, whereas we do not in the same way. So that would be my question.
Anything else? You want to add something?
Yeah, I'm tempted. The current Prime Minister has started a real opposition by trying to reform the labor laws. It's high unemployment among the young.
Sorry, the current Prime Minister of
Italy.
Okay.
And there's strong disincentives to create new jobs in the large companies precisely because it's so hard to fire anybody. There's very little flexibility in the market. And now you see maybe the inflexibility comes because there may be a constitutional right not to be fired. And as you fill out all the requirements here, it looks like the issue of poverty taken as the ground for expanding that bureaucratic state. And it gives rise to the possibility that perhaps it's the stifling of that bureaucratic state that's getting in the way of generating the kind of growth that can indeed lift people out of poverty. So have you given some reflection to that part of the side of all these commitments in the European Constitution?
Thank you. All right. So maybe take 2 minutes apiece or less. There's small questions, so
Very details.
who would like to begin?
2 minutes to answer the question of Patrick. We agreed, yes. No, we decided to study this question, so it's more, the answer to your question is more a research project than an answer. But because you're right, totally right, that there is this sort of opposite paradox, that here in the United States, where at least we have to think that it's more rooted, a sort of individualistic anthropology, we have clearly a much more cohesive society than today in Europe. And so this is the question, is that in this sense, to study constitutional law in Europe today is something, sometimes gives me the feeling more or less to study archaeology. So something in the past, some documents from the past, from a certain past, which, and also in this sense, they could be useful because they could, saying the constitutional documents, because obviously, and I think with the link with Andrea's question, obviously there is something happened outside the legal system that changed completely the landscape. So today, Italy, not only Italy, also Europe, all the European countries, very often they have much more, and they are much more oriented to this individualistic framework. Then obviously created this huge state and so on and so on. So my question, my answer is that probably something outside the legal system, let's say outside something that is inside the social system. Probably education is one of the key factors in this, because the way that people think, the way the people think his relation with reality, with other needs, this is probably the course, the most important question. So in this sense, this is exactly the paradox. But still, we have this kind of constitution. So we can allow our court to have this type of decision that is completely against the stream, that is completely against this idea of a statist intervention. Only a quick answer to the question of the new prime minister is from Florence, so I am Renzi, that is also a very good friend of the United States here. No, we don't have a constitutional right not to be fired. We have, yes, this idea of constitutional right to job. So that means more or less that that the state has to perform political law that try to maximize the employment. It's not obviously the idea that you can go to the court to say the state has to give you a job. But this question of flexibility and relation with our constitution is exactly one big thing that we have to discuss. Yeah. These days, because is it clear that all, for example, the role of unions in our system, exactly because of this, increased in a huge way, so rendering all this question of flexibility very difficult to discuss. Because it's more very hard.
Very shortly, trying to put together the three questions. The individual as such does not exist. It's an imagination, in the sense that, as we were trying to say, we always are in relation to others, to nature, to the institutions, to the market. So it would be interesting to make newly the research Tocqueville did some decades ago, by comparing how is the mixture which is around the individuals in the United States and in Europe. And it's always a mixture, a combination of different elements. So it makes no sense to speak about which society is more individualized. In fact, the problem is to compare the combination of the elements and the possibility to establish a relationship between the individual and the surrounding context. And this is the challenge democratic citizens have in front of this crisis. To reply to your question, in the sense that who has to recognize, well, us as democratic citizens. And I just mentioned in my presentation that the financial crisis is a deep historical crisis, and nothing is going to be as it was before. And at stake, basically, there is a new recombination of the relationship between the individuals and the surrounding institutional economic.
No, I think, the two first questions were received an answer. I would focus on the last question. I agree that there is a strong misunderstanding of the meaning of rights, because individual rights and social rights are not a higher degree, a different degree of the same type of rights. We should get rid of that idea, which was very much supported in Europe, that social rights have the same structure of individual rights. Social rights are a political program that have certain boundaries, and the Constitution itself is not giving an absolute idea of rights. For instance, when we say, when the Constitution says people have the right to health, salute, then it adds and will provide free health care for poor people. So specifically, very often the European doctrine, the European constitutionalists have forgotten the second part of the constitutional soul, which Andrea showed very well in the Article 2. Article 2 says rights, duty and solidarity. Social rights, health care to the poor. So it's not like you have an absolute right to everything, but very specifically the father of the Constitution had the good intention to give to policy a certain direction, in a sense of giving people, all the people in the country, the possibility to have a minimum level of welfare, which is part of the human dignity. In this sense, social rights and human dignity are deeply connected. We cannot separate the two aspects. And in fact, in the Italian Constitution, human dignity is specifically recalled in the context of social rights, not in the context of individual rights, because there dignity is given for granted. So it's just us.
Thank you. Clearly, there's so much more to be said. The questions alone could occupy us for another hour and a quarter. But none of us want to avoid lunch. And so, at a minimum, though, the little bit that we've had from our three guests provide a foil for thinking about poverty here, both normatively, legally, historically, sociologically. So, thank you very much, all of you, for helping.